Okay, this is our celebrity panel. I'm honored on our advisory board. We have two of the most profound public thinkers and public speakers on defense and security policy. We have Admiral Mark Montgomery, United States Navy. He was a carrier task force commander. He was a surface warfare officer, and he was a J5 at European Command, where he dealt with accession into NATO for most of the Eastern Bloc nations that joined NATO. He continues to be active, traveling often to Taiwan, Israel, and he's been to Ukraine with us a half a dozen times. So he's very well experienced in all the security issues going on in the world today. And separately, we have Lieutenant General David Deptula, who spoke earlier. I did not mention, apart from being the guy who invented effects-based targeting and revolutionized air power and the application of air power, he is the dean of the Mitchell Institute, the premier Air Force think tank in Washington. And I looked him up when he joined our organization. He's listed as one of the top 10 air power strategists in history, alongside Billy Mitchell. And so the two brains on our stage are two of the best brains that exist in national security today in the United States or anywhere in the world. And we knew there was no point in moderating, so we're just going to let them speak with you and answer questions afterwards. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, thanks, Andy. That was a pretty serious introduction. But we get more cerebral the more good Ukrainian vodka we have. So that's a plea to ply us with a good food and drink after this. So our panel today is what should we learn and what should we not learn from the Russia-Ukraine war? And I got to tell you, this particular conflict has produced a flood of commentary about the future of warfare. And you've heard some of that already discussed. And the way we're going to run this, and each of us is going to give you about 8-10 minutes of our perspectives up front. Then we're going to sit down and spend the remainder of the hour just listening to what is on your mind and trying to get into a good discussion, a question and answer period. So the question is not whether we should learn from Ukraine. Of course we should. The real question is this. What should we learn and what should we not learn? Now, my answer is pretty simple. Learn with humility, learn with discipline, but learn the right lessons, because Ukraine offers some real lessons. But well, the one thing I would suggest is it doesn't offer a template for the future. Okay, so first, what should we learn? We should learn that modern battle space is more transparent and more lethal than many folks expected. Units have become much easier to find. Movements, particularly of any kind of surface system, well, I'll include air in that too, are much easier to track. Headquarters are easier to target. If just in that regard, if you just look at the exemplar of recent Iranian operations, I mean, the established headquarters for the service components were not used because they're too vulnerable and exposed to attack. Communications are easier to disrupt, and massing forces is much more dangerous than many assume. Now, those facts are all real. They're important, and they're here to stay. We should also learn the importance of adaptation. I mentioned that earlier, everyone gets excited about drones, but it's not necessarily the drones people should get excited about. They should get excited about the rapidity of the adaptation cycle. That's what's really important. Some people have said, well, Ukraine's producing 7 million drones a year. How come the United States isn't? It's not about quantity. If you built 7 million drones in the United States and put them in a warehouse, by the time we broke them out to use them, they wouldn't be of any value. It's the innovation piece. It's the adaptation piece. That's what we need to learn. So Ukraine's shown extraordinary creativity under pressure: camouflage, deception, decentralized tactics, battlefield innovation, low-cost precision attack, and relentless improvisation in the face of danger. And that all deserves respect, and it deserves careful study. We also should learn that logistics and industrial capacity still matter. Again, I touched on some of this morning, but ammunition matters, repair matters, sustainment matters, training matters, stockpiles matter, endurance matters. Wars aren't won by rhetoric; they're won by the ability to generate and sustain combat power. Again, that's not glamorous stuff, but it's extraordinarily important when it comes to determining the outcome of a conflict. And we should also learn that cheap systems can have very expensive effects. You heard some of that in the earlier panels. Low-cost aerial threats and precision strike systems can impose serious costs on forces, infrastructure, and rear areas. And that means that force protection and affordable defense in depth are no longer side issues. We treated them that way over the last 30 years. And then depending upon the amount of money that you have, you prioritize, and force protection gets to be there down at the bottom. That's why we don't have any hardened aircraft shelters in the Pacific. That's why we don't have any hardened command and control facilities. Because folks said, well, it's too important to buy this, that, and the other thing instead of that. But today, these have become central issues. Now, I just want to touch base because I think most of you were here earlier, so I don't want to spend a lot of time repeating what I said, but there are 3 critical lessons, I believe, and I just want to hit them back over again. These are the strategic lessons I think the United States ignores at its peril. And the first one is not providing our adversary sanctuary. Just really, really huge mistake, because by giving them sanctuary, you're providing them the opportunity to operate without any threat. And that was a real mistake. Second is don't give the adversary the gift of time. Again, Russians started this off in an incredibly unimpressive way. Crummy leadership. No leadership through meritocracy, but leadership through, quick way to say it is through corruption. 2 oppositely opposing motivators, crummy training, poor execution, and really exhibited some profound military weaknesses. You saw some examples of that earlier. But time's a weapon. It lets an adversary recover and mobilize to build defenses, expand production. And while they might have been ignorant in many of the categories I just mentioned, they're not stupid, and they learn. And unfortunately, that's what the gift of time gave to them. I tell you what, by withholding weapons early and by failing to provide them in the mass when they could have mattered the most, the West gave Russia the gift of time to stabilize the battlefield and build a formidable war machine. That wasn't a minor delay, it was a strategic gift. Okay, third, again, I won't dwell on this, but don't deny yourself firsthand learning. One of our policy mistakes in the United States was not placing U.S. military personnel in position as observers, not combat forces, but just watching and learning from what is going on. All right, let me turn quickly to what we should not learn. We should not learn that air superiority can be replaced by air denial. That's one of the most dangerous misperceptions coming out of the war. Ukraine is proving what happens when neither side gains enough control of the air to operate freely. And you get in this, very static, long, bloody, punishing war. We should also not learn that tactical improvisation is the same thing as strategic success. This goes back to my point on focusing too much on drones. Ukraine has used low-cost drones with impressive, very impressive effect. They matter. They should be studied. But they've not by themselves produced theater-wide operational freedom or decisive strategic breakthrough. So yes, we need to study them, but not worship them. They're tools. They're not a strategy. And finally, we should not learn that every wartime workaround should become permanent doctrine. Now, this gets a little bit esoteric, but some battlefield adaptations reflect enduring change. Others reflect the specific circumstances of this particular war. And every war is going to be different. The terrain, the force structures, the politics, and the limitations. The job of serious military thought is to know the difference. Not every improvisation is a revolution, not every workaround is a model, and not every lesson is transferable. And that requires judgment. So here's my balanced conclusion. Learn about the transparency of the modern battlefield, the importance of adaptation, the value of low-cost precision attack, the need for stronger force protection, the centrality of the boring topics of logistics, production, and resilience, but also learn the larger strategic lessons. The imperative of air superiority to provide the freedom to attack and the freedom from attack, the imperative not to allow the adversary sanctuary, not to give the adversary the gift of time, not to deprive yourself of firsthand battlefield observation. And do not learn the wrong lesson that enduring principles no longer matter. Do not learn that attrition warfare is a template for the future. Now, doesn't mean we should ignore it. We should aspire to not get into it. Do not learn that denial is the same as control. Don't learn that clever improvisation can substitute for full spectrum military capability. And I was listening at the last panel to that question at the very end, hey, you know, are we buying the wrong stuff with this $1.5 trillion budget? And the answer goes back to, look, if you want the United States to remain as the world's sole superpower, you need to build a spectrum of forces that can win across the spectrum of conflict and conduct everything from humanitarian response, disaster relief, up to global thermonuclear war. That's a big spectrum. And so, you know, when I talk about overenthusiastic about drone warfare, well, first I would suggest to you there's no such thing as drone warfare. There's warfare, and drones are part of the tools to conduct it. But we have to be able to adapt and plan for warfare across the spectrum of conflict. Okay. In the end, the biggest lesson from Ukraine may be this. New technology changes the means of warfare. It does not erase the need for strategy, staying power, and operational freedom. This is what we should remember. Study the innovation, study the resilience, study the warning, but don't confuse survival under pressure with the ideal way to fight. And don't forget this. If you will not strike the enemy's heart, if you will not deny him sanctuary, and if you will give him time to recover, don't expect a short war, a cheap war, or a decisive war. So with that, let me turn it over to my compatriot, Mark Montgomery.
Thanks, General. It's always great to be up with General Deptula. He really is one of the top 10 strategic air power thinkers we've ever had. I mean, I don't know how many are on that list, but he's in the top 10. All right. Hey, just having a little inter-service fun. Hey,
There's no Navy guys.
Yeah, yes, fair enough. And it's appropriate that we're in the Korean War section because I think in the end this is going to turn into one of the longest frozen conflicts we've had, which is with the Korean War. People don't think about it today, but we're to some degree still at war in Korea. Look, first I'm going to talk a little bit about where I see Ukraine, because I think that's important to understand what lessons you get. The first is, and I think Dave shares this with me, and I think most of the UFF team shares this with me, Ukraine is not going to lose. I don't know how I can defend that they're going to win, but I spend enough time with their units and with their people to know that their military resilience is strong enough. They're not going to lose. They might lose 0.1% of land here or 0.1% of their land there, but they are going to militarily not lose this war. I don't know how they regain Crimea, but I know they don't lose. That's an important thing to anchor yourself in when you talk about what are the lessons. The other thing I'd watch this year, if I was watching at home, sitting at home keeping score, there's three things that I think are going to really matter in the short to midterm here. The first is you're going to see a lot more medium range strike by the Ukrainians. This is them hitting Russian units where they aggregate Russian logistics, really kind of pinching Russia before it can get its offensives going. The reason they can do that is they're getting more and more weapons from the United States that could do that. A weapon called the extended range attack munition, a low cost cruise missile. The U.S. Air Force built the perfect weapon for the U.S. Air Force, and they're going to let the Ukrainian Air Force test it for the next 2 years. And I think the Ukrainians are going to get the first 1,100 of them, maybe the first 2,100, and they're going to test them. I mean, they're so new that the U.S. Air Force is still testing them on planes to make sure they're safe. The Ukrainians are testing them on Russians to make sure they're not safe. So they're out there. All right. The second one is long-range strike. This is where they ask us for tomahawks. I have to be honest. I fired a lot of tomahawks. I like the tomahawks. I fired probably 500 of them, and they, like 480 worked pretty well. The tomahawk I fire is not the tomahawk we would sell Ukraine. Ukraine would pay $1.4 million for a tomahawk, and then they'd pay $300,000 for us to remove what's called the survivability features of the tomahawk, which make the tomahawk much more likely to hit its target. So they'd pay a little more for a little less. So I'm not sure that's the right thing. In the meantime, they're building their own long-range strike. And the thing you watch for is the strikes on the refineries. It's being masked right now by the increased oil prices from the Iran war. But when oil prices come down in the late summer, oil prices, not gas prices for us at the pump, but oil prices in the summer start coming back down, Russia is going to be in a hurt locker because they'll have the lower prices with less production, the less production courtesy of Ukrainian long-range strike. So that's the second thing I'd monitor. The third thing I'd monitor is not a positive, it's a negative, it's air defense. They have to be extremely, extremely low on Patriot and NASAMS. Those are the two weapon systems, and the PAC missile and the AMRAAM missile that fire from the NASAMS are, I think their numbers are extremely low. And these are the things that protect their most valuable assets. You'll see if a ballistic missile is headed at an apartment complex, they're not going to take a shot. And they're just going to let it hit and kill Ukrainians. That's the choice they have to make, though, because we have not transferred that. We and the Europeans ran out. And I have to be honest, we put ourselves in a little bit of extremis, and we used a ton, and our Arab partners used a ton, and we're pretty low right now on that number, I would say. Now, we've got some plans. Weirdly, and I say this highly unusually, the U.S. military was ahead of the curve, and Congress approved multi-year contracts, and the Defense Department actually entered into multi-year contracts with Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman to build missiles like THAAD, Patriot, and the Standard missiles that are fired from ships. 4 months before the war in Iran, we signed 7-year contracts on most of those systems to triple or quadruple or even higher, quintuple their production rates, and Tomahawk as well. So this is really abnormal, but before the war, this was done by people who did not know a war was coming. We really started to work this munitions issue. So we'll recover, but not quickly. And I think Ukraine's not going to see a lot of defensive weapon systems. So that's a big thing to watch in the midterm. I'll give you a couple long-term things real quick. First is we are possibly the worst negotiating team in the world. I mean, I say this, I try to be apolitical, but Steve Witkoff has no business negotiating for the United States government. And the inability of he and the president to bring pressure on Vladimir Putin is disgraceful. I could give you 5 strings you could pull almost immediately to make Putin go, ow, and we pull none of them. Not least of which, we're in fact waiving one of the only pressure points we had on him in terms of the sale of sanctioned fossil fuels, which was kind of happening anyway. This just made it a little bit easier to get the money. So number one is get a better negotiating team long term. Number two is the societal resilience of Ukraine is strong. So I say ballistic missiles hit. Life goes on, and you'll hear a discussion of that in the next hour, so I won't go into it, but I'll just tell you, that matters. If your military resilience is strong at the point, i.e. you're not going to lose, and your societal resilience is strong, i.e. you won't break, you're not going to buckle to Russia. So that leads me to my last long-term thing, was that this has got 3 years to go. I know people don't like to hear that. I don't see this getting to a good conclusion before we have a new president. And I just don't think Vladimir Putin quits. I think General Gerasimov, his military chairman, whispers sweet nothings to him that everything's going great. Putin chooses to believe it, even in the face of all the evidence, and he's willing to sacrifice 407,000 Russians every year to death or casualty, or death or wounds, and he doesn't care. So 3 years to go. We got to buckle down, work hard. Places like Ukrainian Freedom Foundation got a lot of work to do because we got to get ready. One last thing I'll say. I said it upstairs in a conferencing group up there with our board, but I'll say it down. I'll say it in the open as well. We've got to help Ukraine reform their Ministry of Defense. They still have way too much Soviet age ligature in it. And if they're going to join NATO fast, like we want them to, say 3.5 years from now, if they don't fix this stuff, they're not going to look like Sweden and Finland that get swept in, with, rainbow, with, lollipops and rainbows. It's going to be a long slog to get in. So let's get ahead of that slog and work the next 3 years to fix their judicial system, their education system, their recruiting systems. That's a lot of work for us to do. And anyway, we need a lot of support on that. Okay, what did we learn? The lessons, mine are the same. The reason I said that stuff is Dave took all my good ideas. I know he was looking at my notes at lunch. I didn't realize what he was doing. All right, I'll say a couple things. The lessons I've learned, data is key. Now, Dave wrote the consummate effects-based planning documents that executed 3 of our last 4 wars. The difference today in Iran is there's now a piece of anthropic AI running inside Dave's plan, making it go 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 times faster. It relies on data. The Ukrainians are doing the same thing, but not with classified overhead imagery like we are. They're doing it with unclassified data. So my biggest lesson learned is we got to figure out how to pull that Ukrainian use of work with unclassified data and bring it into Dave's the Air Force gonculator that has all the classified data in it, because you need both of them. And they're trying to do this on the fly right now in Saudi Arabia and UAE, working with the Ukrainians, and it turns out it's really hard. So number one lesson, figure out how to work unclassified systems and all their data into your classified systems. Number two, drive down the cost of intercept. Dave alluded to this with his discussion of the cost of weapons. What's interesting is the cost of offensive weapons is dramatically dropping in America. By the way, somebody said, are we getting the 1.5 trillion? Are we buying the wrong stuff? Yes. Are we buying the right stuff? Yes. We're buying, with 1.5 trillion, we're buying everything. Don't worry. But we have driven down the cost. This ERAM that the Ukrainians are testing right now is pretty damn kick-ass. It's like one of our long-range weapons that cost about 2.3 million. It costs about 250,000. Now it's only 0.8% effective, and our American one we'll just say is like 0.96% effective. We like 0.96 because a human's life depends. There's a pilot riding in his own version of a missile right behind it, right? And you want that 0.96% effect. The Ukrainians are willing to take a couple 0.8s. By the way, a 0.8 times and a 2 0.8s is 0.02, 0.2, 0.2, 0.04, 0.96, 96%, same thing. I just did very high end. I'm a nuclear engineer. I did high end math for you there. But two 80% missiles is one 96% missile is what I'm telling you. And if you can get them for 10% the cost, you just saved 80%. So I'm all for that. So, getting the cost per cent. Here's the problem. We have not figured out how to drop the cost of defensive weapons down. Offensive weapons are kind of stupid. They fly a place, you can print them on a 3D printer, they fly out to a place, a GPS tells them hit this spot, or a laser tells them hit this spot. Defensive weapons, man, that missile's going like Mach 4. There's another missile coming Mach 4, and it's moving a little. And the two of you got to move your missile, adjust its flight so that you two end up in a 1 meter by 1 meter box, and you got to know it explode at that microsecond. Everything I just described costs dollars. A THAAD missile costs $10 million. A Patriot missile costs $4 million. The standard missiles that we use to defend Israel cost $13 to $20 million. Even the easier kind of air-to-air missiles we have are around $1 million. The AMRAAMs are around $1 million. These are expensive weapon systems. And we have not figured out how to make that really smart stuff happen fast, cheap. So a good thing, figure out how to get the cost of weapons down. And then the things I wouldn't learn are the exact same things Dave said. Air power matters. I get that it's not determinative in Ukraine. It's pretty freaking determinative in Iran. Now, whether we're not achieving our strategic objectives there, that's a political failure by the president. They are achieving their military objectives because air power matters, and our air power is kicking the bejesus out of their air power. And, I know we get distracted by saving one pilot, and it looks like, my God, we had to go save a pilot. It took us a whole day. That's just because that's our belief that we never leave somebody behind. We went and saved that damn pilot. By the way, in the middle of nowhere, in their own country, we were able to do that. But on top of it, what was really happening was every day we were applying 700 strikes, 500, 700 strikes to them a day. So air power matters. Maritime power matters. I get that in the Black Sea, unmanned surface vessels have put the Russian Navy back in their ports, behind barriers hiding in their ports. But it would not be the same out in the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans, where you have distance and maneuver and the ability to get away from these things and then eviscerate them over time. So I'm less worried about that. Don't learn that lesson. The final thing is, and I agree with two more things on this. One, don't limit your strike geography. Dave called it sanctuary. I agree. You can't let an enemy, you can't say we're not going to hit Russian forces in Russia. Because then Russian forces will just hang out in Russia to do it, before they wind up and going on the attack. That's crazy. And then finally, don't give a country $60 billion. We gave in security assistance Ukraine $60 billion, and they used it really well. And by the way, none of that was corrupt. We gave them $62.4 billion. $60.2 billion was spent in America. If it was corrupt, it was because Arkansas is corrupt, or California is corrupt, or whatever. It wasn't Ukrainians. And the last $2 billion was to Norway, which I think is a generally non-corrupt country, right? Our military security funds were spent on military security weapons that killed Russians, period. But you don't give someone $60 billion and not send in lessons learned teams. It is crazy what we don't know as a military. By the way, there's two places in the world where active duty generals and admirals can't visit routinely. Ukraine, the war we're in, and Taiwan, the war we're about to be in. We're the most insane country when it comes to these things. We allow Russia and China to deter us from working with our key allies and partners. That's crazy. So from my perspective, those are things I wouldn't learn. I know it went a little long, but I had to figure out something to say after Dave said all the smart stuff. Thanks a lot.
Okay, over to you all. Please use the mic up here so everyone can hear what your question is.
And we got 18 solid minutes, so let's go.
Nice time.
Thank you. Big question. How does this war end?
Look, I think 3 years from now, an American president comes in, the most likely scenario, 3 years from now, an American president comes in and puts real pressure on Vladimir Putin, and he has to come to some kind of negotiated settlement. And I would call it a cessation of hostilities, not a ceasefire, because it would not even meet the standard of a ceasefire. But there'll be a cessation of hostilities, sort of like Korea. You may have to have UK and French forces on the line monitoring it, but I think it takes a strong-willed U.S. president bringing the soft power of America to bear on Russia. Be clear, here's Russia's actual economy right now. Russia's economy is 46% fossil fuel sales. That's incredible. That's like Iran, or they're more like 80%, or the Arab countries are at 60 to 70. They've turned into basically a petrostate. My old boss John McCain used to call them a gas station masquerading as a country. They're one step above that. And here's why it matters. If you can cut off the delivery of that, the money that goes to are two things: 44% to fund the war machine, and 56% for what I call babushka payments, or payments to his base, to keep people happy with him. They're not putting money into critical infrastructure. They're not putting money into R&D. They're not putting money into anything other than the military and payments to the base. So if you can cut the money going in, he's got to pick between fighting the war and losing his domestic political credibility. And in the end, he'll have to stop fighting the war. So for me, that's the number one way for the war to end, is a tough U.S. president.
Yeah, I'll add one other thing here, and I know it's a long shot, but there are no reporters here, right? No TV cameras for now. Okay. I always ask that question too late, but if you could motivate the current president to capitalize on his blockade success into, if he wants to halt the Russia-Ukraine war, perhaps provide that same kind of a blockade against Mr. Putin's oil imports and exports, huh? Maybe he might, well, okay. I'm just saying that's an option that might speed up Monty's 3 years. Okay, next question.
Is there maybe a concern that Ukraine is going to be winning this war, Russia's feeling that they're going to lose it, that there's a concern that Russia might use a tactical nuclear?
Look, earlier I made comments about the one thing you can be certain about warfare is the uncertainty of what might happen. So of course there's a probability that that might happen, but I think the probability is very, very, very low. First, by the way, and this isn't on you, but there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. There's low yield weapons and there are high yield weapons. But they all have strategic impact. And the next time someone uses a nuclear weapon, it will have strategic repercussions. And that's why I think the probability of use is very, very low. Because even Putin knows that if he did that, he would be a pariah around to include China. And I'm sure our friends in China have made that message very clear to Mr. Putin not to do that.
I pick on that last point. I agree. The Chinese have told him that. But your question brings out a great point, which is, to what degree is our fear of provocation going to drive our decision making? Because that's a fear of provocation. I don't want to provoke them with a nuclear weapon. I think it's hard for democracies. We want everyone to like us. We want to consensually solve problems. And we don't want to provoke an authoritarian. I'm afraid, with the number of authoritarians that are out there now and the rapacity with which they're acting, I think we have to take that slight risk. And I agree there's a slight, very, very low risk. But he would actually, if he used a tactical nuclear weapon, he'd lose the war. Because China would fully abandon him. And we would bring full sanctions against him, as would everyone else in the world except like Belarus and North Korea and Iran, 3 countries that don't matter. So I think I think it'll happen, and I don't think we should let our fear of that government. It definitely impacted the Biden administration's thinking for the first 2 years of the war. I think by the 3rd year, they figured it out that it was not a legitimate threat. But the first 2 years of support, every decision was hedged. That's why we were late with the M1A1, late with the Gimler, the guided missile launcher rockets. We were late with the F-16. We were late with the ATACMS, because every time we put it through a 8-month, fear of provocation calculator. Good question, though.